Gela Kasla, Nugwa Amanda. Hi, my name is Amanda. I am a Indigenous support worker at Pentledge. I wanted to acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territory of the Ayiksen, Pentlatch, and the Comox First Nations. I'd like to thank them for the privilege of living, playing, and working on the land, and the gift of working with their children. I wanted to share today a story which was created by Suzanne Camp. She's a district resource cultural aide. The story has been shared within the school district, and I was hoping to share it today. As I progress with the story, I just wanted you to keep in mind that on this bead timeline, each bead that you see represents one generation. So a generation in this sense being that from the time that you are a baby to the time that you are a grown-up and are able to have a child of your own. So in this case, a generation right now is 20 years. So on the bead timeline, there is 5 beads, which is showing us this is going to be 100 years. So there are 500 beads on the timeline, which represents 500 generations. So if you are 6 years old on the timeline, you would be represented in one of these beads. If you were 10 years old, you would be represented in half of one of these beads. So all over the world, no matter where you come from, each of us all can be represented on this bead timeline. Every culture and all people have a place on a timeline like this. We are going to journey back in time. So every time that you see the beads change color on the timeline, we are going back 5 generations or 100 years. So we're going back all the way to 10,000 years. 10,000 years is how long Indigenous people, there has been evidence of longer actually, 14,000 years. So we're going back in time. Indigenous people have lived here for 10,000 years along the Pacific Northwest coast. Some of the evidence we can look back on are stone tools and ancient fire pits that we can see from people from that long ago. Our people's stories, history, and culture were passed down from generations, and this information, these stories, this knowledge was passed down by speaking and listening and remembering. And so each generation would soak up that information and share it to the next generation. Children in villages would hear these stories and hear them over and over again. And then later on, they would be able to remember and share those stories. So from generation to generation, the stories were shared that way. This is long before books were written, before there was written or reading. It was the storytelling. So verbally telling, listening, and remembering. As we've gone back down through our timeline, I just wanted to point out, so this here is showing us 10,000 years ago, and so I've added the most recent evidence of Indigenous people here on the northwest coast. So this bead here represents the Ice Age, 10,000 years ago. And so then as we continue on the timeline, this piece of string represents when cedar trees initially started growing. So this is about 6,000 years ago in BC. And so we continue on our timeline, and this one here, this triangle one, represents the pyramids. So we kind of think of that as being, you know, historic. So this is where that is on our timeline. Remember the cedar trees, Ice Age, and then evidence of indigenous people being here. So as we continue on our bead timeline, this bead here represents our current calendar years. So this is when we first started recording our days of the week. If we continue on our bead timeline, if any of you have visited the fishing weirs, the fish traps down when you go to where the air park is, this on the timeline represents when those were being used here in the valley, in Comox. And so we continue down, getting a little bit more recent times here. So around this time, this is when European people started, settlers were started to move to Canada, around the time of residential schools, and representing about when Canada first became a country. And here we are today. So visually, as you can see, and as I say, our stories, indigenous people and their stories, have been told over time, spoken from elders, from culture keepers, spoken, listened to, and then all the stories were remembered. And that is how we share our stories, our culture, over time in our communities, and are be able to share that. I hope you enjoyed a story that I've had the privilege to be able to learn myself and be able to share today. As a challenge or something that you could look into doing is make a timeline for yourself, for your own life. So if you are 10 years old, you would use maybe 10 beads, and each bead would represent a year of your life. You could choose a bead for birth, for your first year, and that bead would resonate and be special to you on your timeline. And then as you continue, things that stand out in your mind of different stories and things that you remember and would want to share in your lifetime, those beads would represent that to you, and you could share that with your family, with your loved ones. Kayla Kasla, hi Chika.